This is Bonjour Chai, the Thank God Laura Secord Still Loves Israel edition. I'm Avi Feingold in Montreal, and I'm here with Melissa Lantzman in Toronto and Alana Zakon in Vancouver. We are your Frozen Chosen. On today's episode, we will examine the sex lives of Jewish teens.
What?
And we'll figure out whether we should care at all about Jewish reality television. But before we get to that, let's hear from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by our sponsor, Atelier Lou Bijouterie in Montreal, Quebec. Atelier Lou specializes in watches and custom design jewelry along with a curated selection of designer jewelry. Visit them online or in person, and Eric Goldberg will help make your jewelry dreams come true. Atelier Lou is offering a promo code for all Bonjour Chai listeners using BON18 at checkout for 10% off your order at atelierlou.com.
So, I didn't even want to talk about this topic. Whatever, I got outvoted, which is totally fine. Alana, can you explain to me what my unorthodox life is and why I should care about it?
I will preface this by saying that, well, this will all make sense in a second, but I couldn't even bring myself to watch the actual show. I watched clips about it, I watched interviews about it, but because of how uncomfortable I feel about the show existing, which I'll explain in a second, I couldn't even watch it. So why I think that this is relevant, and this is coming from my perspective as an actor who is Jewish in the film and TV industry, amongst other acting industries, is that so often we see this exact same narrative. We see this in Unorthodox, in the movie Disobedience. The list goes on and on and on. And while I think it's totally valid for this woman, Julia, to have this perspective, and for those of you who haven't watched the show, it's basically about a woman who was in a more religious Jewish community who decides to leave the Jewish community and become engross herself in the world of fashion, and she kind of takes her whole family with her, and then they have varying degrees of comfort with this change, is that the Jewish community is so nuanced. We have so many different types of Jews of various different religious denominations. We have all different types of ethnicities within Jewish communities from all around the world, and everything is so nuanced and different. And from an outside perspective, if we see the same narrative over and over and over about Orthodox Jews being oppressed and being contained in these communities that they need to leave in order to be their full selves, in order to be happy, that sends this message to the non-Jewish world who is consuming this media that it's bad. And even in my own life, outside of media, having lived in the Mile End for a long time in Montreal, which is an area that is Hasidic Jews and hipsters, basically, I heard so many people who are not Jewish make these comments about Hasidic people being like, yeah, it looks really culty to me. Why do they all dress the same? Why don't they look at me in the eye if I'm a woman? And to me, that's extremely problematic. And with the rise in anti-Semitism, I don't know that this is the narrative that we need. And I watched a great interview with Alison Josephs and Abby Stein on Jews in the City, where she talks about how she actually pitched positive representations of Orthodox Jews to Netflix, and they didn't want it. And to me, that's extremely telling that they do have an agenda of trying to get across this particular story. So anyway, I could go on and on and on.
They may not have just liked her pitch.
I don't think so.
Maybe, but we don't see any.
We don't see
any representation. Look, I gotta tell you, I'm gonna jump in here, and I'm not a TV watcher, although I've tried. I've tried to get into TV. Even a pandemic couldn't get me watching TV. Because for most people that know me, they know that I watch news and baseball games, and that's about it. So I did watch this. I watched the first couple episodes, and it's so cringe. I hate this show so much, and I think I hate it for part of the same reason that you do, Alana. But more than that, I think it's so dangerous that the mainstream media message around Orthodoxy or Judaism in general is so negative. Also, the show is completely fake. There is, for those who haven't watched the show, I'm not going to recommend it, but it looks contrived and fake, and the conversations and the conflict are all like Looney Tunes, like reality show, but not real. So the idea that it is even real is one. But what it does is it's, the worst anti-Semites in history are the self-hating Jews, and it's those who pervert the narratives or the rituals and frame them in a different way that are negative to so many people whose lives that's not the truth, and that's a really dangerous game. So you've got what I see as the self-hating Jew as the main character here, who just hates everything about her existence, coupled with the fact that people who don't know anything about Jews are seeing a depiction of Orthodox Judaism as something that you need to run away from. Well, that is the silent attack on, I think, on religion, on religious freedom, and it is what we are seeing now, and it is part of a culture that is so dangerous to the continuity of religion. I don't watch a lot of TV, but now I'm not convinced that I'm like a TV person, and I hate this so much.
I have a few things to comment on that. First off, I actually did find testimonials from people who grew up with this woman and know her family, and they really called her out on a lot of things that were incorrect, and she made it seem like she came from a much more oppressive community than she did when she was in like a black hat community. It wasn't like ultra Hasidic and much more liberal than she made it seem. On top of that, something that was pointed out in the interview that I mentioned before with Alison Josephs is that if you do a little digging, you don't see a lot of other religions or cultural groups that have this theme. Do you see shows about Muslim people leaving the Muslim community? Like, I don't see that very often, if at all. I've never heard of a show like that. So it's almost like, why is it that Jewish people always need to have this narrative? It just feeds into the anti-Semitism. And I will disagree with you that I don't think that self-hating Jews are the worst anti-Semites in history. I don't think it's necessarily a good thing, and it's not helping us in any way. But I think there are people that we should be a lot more afraid of.
I am so indifferent about this whole series. Like, I watched an episode. I'll tell you why. Because as you said, and you prefaced your whole discussion, Alana, with the fact that, as a professional, as an actor, as somebody in the industry, and that just frames it right away. This is not reality. Right? This is quote unquote reality. They are actors. They are clearly heightening the tension, and clearly stories are interesting. Nobody wants a story about a family that's just living. So they're always looking for something which is a story. And the story happens to be, in this case, that. Do you think that Italians liked it? How for decades, the only story that they would hear about Italians within Hollywood was mafia? Do you think that blaxploitation?
Right. So then why should it be any different for us?
But that is part of it. And yes, we're going through this thing. But nobody really thinks that all Italians are connected to the mafia. That's my point. Is that at the end of the day, anybody has remote savviness about media, and this is not just now, this is 50 years ago, this is 100 years ago, right, should recognize that what representation is versus what reality is are very, very different. And if you can't figure that out, that this is not what ex-Orthodoxy looks like, then you're probably one of those people that thinks that porn is a true representation of human sexuality.
Some people do, unfortunately.
I'm aware that people do, but that's part of the narrative, is that we talk about this and we tell people, we don't say don't watch porn. We say, recognize that some people say don't watch porn, but the people that are pro-porn say this is a fantasy world. This is not the way sex exists in reality, and you should know the difference between the two. And that's on the Orthodox world. And it was wonderful that so many of them came to their rescue and said, yes, this is what Orthodoxy looks like for me. But there were many people that went and said, you know what? It is complicated, and it is messy, and it is tough, and there is a lot to walk away from. Right? There's a lot of stuff that is really, really bad about Orthodoxy, and I put it on them. Right? I don't put it on the media to go and say, well, because your house is a little messy and disgusting right now, then we're not going to portray it until you fixed it. Right? The media says, look, we have a bit of a dumpster fire of a community where they're telling women to do this stuff. And some people are saying, no, we're not really telling this woman this stuff. And other people are saying, yes, it is. Well, as long as that stuff is happening, then the media is going to portray it. The media is going to say, well, let's put a lens on that. And it's not up to the media to go and say, well, I'm going to be nice and I'm not going to cover this right now. The media is just interested in eyeballs, and the media is interested in stories that sell. And this is a story that's selling right now.
But we have so many of these stories. Do we really need more?
Tell me, do we need more Holocaust movies?
I mean, like, sure, sometimes, but that
Why?
we shouldn't always be.
I gotta say, like, if the depiction of Jews is Jewish people leaving the Orthodox world, or the Holocaust, in terms of our relationship to the state of Israel, we're losing, and it's a losing battle, and it's not accurate, and it goes further than that. What it does is it makes it acceptable to depict Jews in this way as a generalization. And I'm not even an observant Jew. I'm not from, but I am so offended by the fact that the world sees the Jewish community as either this or that, and there's nothing in between. I think that that's a huge disservice, and I think it's more problematic than that.
But those things exist in between. We just don't think about them, and we champion them in this way, but we don't end up, like, as soon as something big happens, we forget the fact, for example, that one of the greatest characters to come out of the past 30 years in Hollywood to me was, right, somebody who goes up and says, I don't roll on Shabbos, right? I'm Shomer fucking Shabbos, right? That's a great piece. He's a religious Jew in some way or another, but nobody goes and says, oh, we don't have representation of three-dimensional Jewish complex characters. They just push him to the side. A Serious Man, wonderful film, doesn't talk about, right, he may not be super orthodox, but he's clearly somebody who's grappling with his faith. Nobody goes and says, well, there's no representations of Judaism that are good. What was that comedy, The Goldbergs? What's that whole sitcom?
Well, I catch it. You can catch it if you're in a plane.
George and Estelle Costanza, right? How many people? There's so many places where we see
They're not Jewish characters, though.
Oh, come on, they're basically Jewish.
They are, but they aren't. And why is that? That's what you need to ask.
So fine. So Jerry's parents in
show?
Seinfeld.
Sure.
Jerry's parents on Seinfeld, right? They're the same thing. And I think it's just like, but whatever it is, there actually are lots of Jewish characters, lots of normalized Jewish characters around, the same way we actually have lots of normalized, not, really flouncy gay characters anymore, and we don't have Italian characters that are purely mafioso, and we don't have, we have gotten three-dimensional, but nobody stops.
No, but look at the inequity in this. Like the amount of people who have become, who've become more observant over the course of their lifetimes, or movements like Chabad, or movements, any Bolsheva movement, where you have just droves of people joining the faith in a different way than they grew up, is exponentially larger than the one person that leaves that makes up stories about how oppressive her life used to be. And there's no even keel on this, and it just goes to show you that it's just not the truth. And if that's how we're being depicted, that's a problem that we should all see.
I'll say that I'm somewhere in between both of you right now, because I do think that there are stories like this that do happen, and I do agree with you, Avi, that there is a lot of experiences like this. Sure, that is super valid, but the difference is that we are in the Jewish community, so we understand that, and I do not believe that the greater world really, I think you're giving them too much credit. And I will end my point on the article that I really love that I've been sending to all my friends by Melina Saval, Too Jewish for Hollywood, as anti-Semitism soars, Hollywood should address its enduring hypocrisy and hyperbolic caricatures of Jews. Because it really talks about, like, why is Mrs. Maisel played by a very, very non-Jewish actor? Why is it that every time that it's a positive portrayal of Jews, for the most part, they bring in, even playing Ruth Bader Ginsburg, they had someone on hold that was Jewish, and they brought in someone else. Why is it that we always end up having to play the more self-hating versions of a Jewish portrayal? I think that's something to think about.
First of all, I'm so glad you brought that up, Melissa, because that is a point that I like to make over and over again. And I like to remind people that if we really care about people and we welcome people making big changes in their lives and saying, you know what, I want to become more religious and more observant through Chabad or through Aish HaTorah or through any other organization, we have to accept that as human beings, right, the opposite can and does and will and should happen, right? Becoming Jewish or becoming more observant is not a one-way path. Right? There will be an equal number of people that say, this is not for me. And as soon as people say, this is for me, yay, this is the coolest thing ever. But as soon as people say, this is not for me, oh, you don't really get it. It's wrong. You didn't really understand it. It's not for you, right? And we like to push those things away. And it's important for us to recognize that religion is a two-way street. People become religious and people leave religion. And it is up to orthodoxy to go and show that. And you know what? There are. I'll give you two examples. Bidi Deitch, she is a marathon runner that is Orthodox. She covers her hair. She wears a skirt. She missed being in the Olympic trials by like apparently yay much. And whatever, it's a cool story. And people put that out there and say, this is cool. This is amazing. There's an Orthodox woman that is an American Ninja Warrior right now. She's on the upcoming season. It's acting, it's reality TV, but it's fitness. And she's pretty badass, if you ask me. And there's a lot of great stuff coming out of the Orthodox world, right? And they are doing all that. The only thing is that they're not touting the stories that they don't like, and other people are. And, that's why I'm kind of blasé. And I think that the education that has to happen is where we go and say, become better media savvy consumers, rather than saying this is a bad story and we can never put these things up. Because then essentially what we're saying is we're not allowed to air
not never, just not always.
We're not allowed to air our dirty laundry, or we don't like it when other people air our dirty laundry. And unfortunately, if there's dirty laundry to be aired, then that's what happens. Last week, New Voice's website published an article entitled "How Jewish Youth Groups Are Breeding a Toxic Sexual Culture for Teens." In it, the author, Shira Wolkenfeld, outlines how groups such as USY and BBYO foster spaces where hookup culture has run amok and power has become some kind of sexual currency. To many of those who have attended Jewish youth groups, this is nothing new, but it does feel like we're at some kind of a tipping point here. With us to discuss this is Rahel Bayar. Rahel is the founder of the Bayar Group, a consultancy that works with camps, schools, corporations, and faith-based organizations to sensitize them to where and how sexual misconduct, harassment, and abuse could be happening within an organization, and helps them create change that fosters safe spaces within those organizations. Rahel, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Can you help us define what's going on here? Because this seems both very bad, but also confusing, since it's really peers and it's not some sort of, sexual predator, Weinstein, Epstein situation, although many of the kids might be Weinsteins or Epsteins, where powerful individuals are taking advantage of others. How is this not just teens having sex?
Well, I think that in order to really answer that question, we have to be able to take a step back and recognize that there isn't one type of abuse or one type of harassment that exists. And that because we're a whole world made of people that have individual experiences and individual places where they express those experiences, we can't just look at it in a monolithic form, right? So if what we're really doing is we're taking a look at how teens are interacting with each other, I think the framing of the question very much needs to be, okay, this may not be a predator situation, but what is happening may be just as significant, just as impactful, and just as bad.
I'm curious to know the history a bit about your work with the Bayar Group. Can you tell us what that came out of? Did you see a need that was missing in the community and in institutions?
Sure. So I'm a former sex crimes and child abuse prosecutor from the Bronx District Attorney's Office, where I was for a number of years coming out of law school. It really set the foundation for the formative years of my being an attorney and wanting to be able to add value in a significant way. When I left the DA's office, after having worked there for a number of years, I transitioned to a global investigative company, and I was a managing director in their sexual misconduct consulting and investigations division. And for a number of years, I really traveled the country pre-COVID. I would say during COVID, it was mostly Zoom, to be able to work with all different types of youth-serving organizations as well as corporate workplaces on historical abuse investigations, on boundary-crossing behavior investigations, on investigations when you have teens that may have interacted with each other where there is an accusation or an allegation of a lack of consent. And one of the other things that I've spent many years doing is working on what it means to prevent the very crimes that we spent so many years prosecuting. What it means to really take a look at the places where we are, whether it's a faith-based place or a school or a camp or a youth organization, and say, how do we fix this before the problems actually happened? And so I ended up going out on my own and founding my own consultancy, really to focus on that on that issue. How do we prevent these things from happening? And so I take a focus on what it means to do trainings and workshops and really have impactful conversations about preventing these very things before they happen.
I actually want to know, and you touched on something, I want to know if you're hearing from, in this particular case, from a community that just sort of refuses to think that this is happening in their backyard. And what are some of the, give me a little bit about what you've encountered and how you maybe fight that off if in fact it is happening.
So I actually think that when it comes to any issues of abuse or harassment, or honestly, issues in how teens relate to each other and consent and things of that sort, that's a big bucket of topics, right? It's not all the same thing. And what I would say is, no matter what community I go into, no matter what religion it is, what type of place it is, the socioeconomic, situation, what race, it doesn't really matter. There's this overwhelming feeling of maybe there's an issue, but does it really happen here? Is this really a problem here? And I really think that when it comes to issues of abuse and harassment, it's this not talked about, right? This untalked about, I don't think that's actually proper grammar, but we're going to go with it anyway.
Unspoken.
Equalizer. Unspoken. Thank you. That unspoken issue of it's a great equalizer.
So what you're saying is that and this is endemic to all smaller communities or all organizations or all communities in general, everybody thinks that the grass is greener on their side and that problems are elsewhere, but they're not with us.
Or even adding to that, it's not just that problems are elsewhere. I think a lot of times what we'll encounter is, are these really problems, right? Are these really issues? So it's not even that these are definitely issues in that place. It's, does this stuff really happen the way that we talk about? Does it really happen the way that it's being reported in the news? How bad is it? Is it are we dramatizing things? Are we making a bigger deal than they need to be?
We see this in the article where you have some of the representatives from these youth organizations that are basically saying, yeah, I sort of hear about it, but we don't really, anytime a whiff of this comes up, we push it out of the way. We say this does not exist in our community, or this shouldn't exist in our community, when it's in reality, the participants are saying, how could you be ignoring this? This is so much everywhere.
Yeah, and the truth is I see a lot of people who are able to acknowledge and really able to understand that this stuff does happen, or recognize that just because they haven't seen it, this stuff does happen. But I think it's really hard when there's someone on one side saying, this is happening right here, and you have other people that may not be hearing it in the way that they need them to.
Yeah. I think it speaks to the whole movement in general with #MeToo. I don't know about any of you, but for me, when that came out, it actually had me reflect on experiences that I hadn't realized were very non-consensual or assault, or experiences that I'd heard of from other people, because it really wasn't part of my education growing up in the 90s. Certainly not even earlier decades for other people. So it kind of makes me wonder, where do we start? Is it the institutions themselves, the camps, the schools, that need to educate young people on consent and on these types of healthier relationships? Or does it start in the home, a bit of both? What are your feelings about it?
I think we can't take a bifurcated approach ever when it comes to changing a cultural norm or changing what society needs. When I walk into, let's use schools as an example, right? I walk into schools to do trainings for faculty and staff on preventing abuse or boundaries with kids or any of these things that are really, really important. Well, you can give the best training and the best workshop in the world to faculty and staff, but at the same time, what happens when parents ask them to cross boundaries with their kids, right? Or what happens when a kid pushes a boundary and there's a staff member that just doesn't know how to set that line in a way that doesn't, create some sort of appearance of impropriety. And I think it happens, in any type of situation. If we bifurcate it and say, we're only going to train our kids or teens on consent, on the dangers of, let's say, hookup culture, on what it means to have an understanding of misogyny and harassment and abuse, and speaking up as people that care about other people. If we only treat it as a kid issue, then we're doing a disservice to everyone, right? Parents need to know how to talk to their kids about these issues. And schools and camps and youth groups how to know when to be able to implement workshops and policies and conversations about these issues. And kids themselves need to grapple with these issues. We have to be able to take a holistic approach when it comes to this.
Is it a lack of education though, or is it something different?
I don't know. That's a great question. I think that there are so many fantastic people and organizations that I have, really been privileged to go in and work with and to help facilitate making their spaces safer and better. But it really takes a partnership, right? So I think that there are a lot of people who really understand the need for that partnership, for growth and for change. And I think that there are a lot of people that don't, right? So I think that it's a really hard question to answer.
So I actually think that the article actually really hit a point specifically within the Jewish community that I think is unspoken of and really gets at the core of what's going on here, which is that on the one hand, we may be teaching our kids about consent, and we may be teaching our kids about, sexual propriety within a Jewish context, and that there's Jewish values around being, whether you want to call it modest or proper or consent, whatever it is. But on the other hand, every kid there knows that they're basically there so that they can meet other Jews and marry other Jews. And so they're torn in this, well, we're here on the one hand to do Jewish stuff, but we're not doing a ton of Jewish stuff. The thing that we're supposed to be doing that is Jewish, or at least that the message that they get from all the interviewees in the article is, shtup like rabbits so that we can have more Jews, right? Because that's the answer to the world or to the Jewish world. And kids are conflicted in this way. And I guess they don't really they may not have the ethics or the deep values there to help them think about what does that mean to be in a committed relationship or not, because they're a bunch of horny teenagers that are being told, do this, but don't really do this because you have to wait a few years, but we want to set the base right here, right? Is there anything in that locus of thinking that does apply to the Jewish community or doesn't? What's going on here?
Well, I think that in the article, actually, Sheila Katz said it best, and I want to give her credit because what she said really resonated with me tremendously. She said something to the effect of, and this may not be a direct quote, but it was something to the effect of, it's time for the Jewish community to stop pretending that hookup culture is not a threat to young people, right? That it's about systemic misogyny that objectifies women and girls. And I would even take that a step further. It objectifies people. Right? It objectifies individuals. And I think that we can have a real conversation about things like Judaism and community and peoplehood, or what it means to think through, intermarriage versus not. That is a separate question and a separate discussion from something that creates this toxicity that is really about devaluing us as individuals and devaluing kids, right? Their bodies and who they are does not serve the purpose of making sure that there is continuity. Their voices can actually affect change to share that. But the truth is, as the adults in the room, we have to be the ones to say, these are actually two very separate things. And there's no reason that we should be excusing bad behavior. It doesn't mean it's an easy conversation to have, right? It doesn't mean that there's a simple way to solve this. And I think that one of the things that came out in the article is you have a lot of organizations putting policies in place or trying to think about staff training in a meaningful way. How do you do that when you have young people that are on staff to begin with? These are great questions, but they're questions that we have to be able to ask. And honestly, we have to be able to answer. Because if we don't, we're doing everyone a disservice.
Rabbi Danya Rottenberg says it most succinctly when she goes and says that the whole discussion and dialogue around interfaith relationships and intermarriage is totally problematic when essentially what it's doing is reducing Jewish women to uteruses for more Jewish babies.
100%.
I was going to say that I think looking back on my own experiences growing up in a lot of Jewish institutions, first off, the conversation was never had at all, ever, around healthy consent. But then also, it feels like a lot of these incidents happen behind closed doors. And that's, to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, like more about teens in general than necessarily like a Jewish problem or an institution problem. It's like teens want to be rebellious. And so as soon as they're out of sight from parents, because looking back, I feel like the most, toxic hookup culture type settings were on, away from parents, like on like a retreat, a Shabbaton, a dance camp, or that type of stuff. So it's kind of hard to know how to interject. It makes me even think about bullying scenarios for young kids where a teacher might come and talk to the two kids and be like, you shouldn't bully the other kid. And then the bully is like, haha, how lame. The teacher told me to do that. I'm going to keep bullying you because you told on me. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, how do you actually get into the heads of the kids so that they actually realize what they're doing is wrong, without having that authority figure just telling them what to do, which oftentimes just doesn't work from my memory of being young.
Right. I always liken it to the difference between talking at people versus talking with people, right? There's a difference between facilitating conversation and being able to engage people, whether it's teens or honestly younger kids, right? Because consent education shouldn't start with teenagers. It should start with people that are younger, right? So it's about being able to figure out how to bring them into the conversation so that they can help change the narrative. And I want to be clear, it doesn't mean that the onus to change the narrative rests on them. It really still rests on us. But like, if your response to something like this is, let's create policies and let's create a reporting protocol, and then before a Shabbaton or before a retreat or before something, we're going to stand up there and we're going to tell everybody what they can and can't do. It's what I like to call the check the box approach. We're going to check the box. We're going to go down the list. We're going to make sure that we've done everything. So like everyone from our insurance companies to our parent body knows we totally covered it all. And then we're going to put that piece of paper back in a binder that's going to sit on a shelf and collect dust and pretend like that was effective. Then you're doing everyone a disservice, right? That's not what it means to have a meaningful conversation. And with teens especially, even though the focus of Jewish youth groups are not going to be a whole weekend retreat about consent, if for decades and decades the focus of a youth group has been, whether it's implicit or explicit, continue being Jewish and make sure that you date someone that's Jewish, well, then we need to take the time to unravel that. And that's not going to happen during a 10-minute lecture on a Friday before it's time to go, bring in Shabbat. And we have to recognize that there actually does need to be time taken to unravel all of that stuff that's happened over so many decades.
I have a question in terms of some of the disciplinary measures that you may not be seeing, and you don't talk much about that. But it used to be that if you did something wrong on any of these Shabbatons or at camp, that like there was always the kid that got kicked out of camp, and it seems like that doesn't happen anymore. It's like we have to create a community around the kid that is struggling with their discipline issues, and I'm wondering if there's just no kind of hard love, and if these issues are akin to what you see sometimes in the community as stigma around drug use or not talking about mental health. Is this just all in a bucket of goods where we can't say that there's a problem, so everybody tiptoes around it?
That actually has not been my experience, and maybe it's because when someone calls me in, maybe they're in this different bucket of like, we know that you're going to mean business. Like, nobody calls in the former sex crimes prosecutor unless they actually want to see something happen, right? So maybe it's the people that might choose to call me, but I have to tell you, I've seen plenty of camps send people home, staff and kids. I've seen plenty of schools decide that there is someone that's not safe to be in their school, whether that's an adult or whether that's a kid, right? And I have actually, and look, there have been plenty of times where I myself have been put in a situation where I said to someone, this is someone that shouldn't be around other kids. And it doesn't mean, by the way, that they don't need help and that it isn't important to get them that help, right? And it doesn't mean that there isn't the ability to come back in some way or to work on certain things. But when you have a teenager, that let's use an extreme example, right? Let's use the example of rape. You have a teenager that rapes someone else, aside from the fact that the police should be called and law enforcement should be involved, and that's not something that should ever be handled internally. If it's not safe to have somebody there, you don't have someone there, right? And so for me, I have no problem setting a hard line, and I definitely think it's the Bronx prosecutor in me that is like, this is what we have to do. But there's a way to do that with compassion, and there's also a way to set a line. And maybe it is, like, as you said, that there are a lot of places that have a hard time and that struggle with it. And maybe part of how we get to a place where the struggle is not so, or rather where the struggle doesn't necessarily mean we don't do anything, right? That there's total inaction, is that we actually have to talk about it. We have to talk about when it's not safe to have someone around.
Do you notice any changes generationally? Because I've heard a lot of stories from friends of mine who teach young kids that it's just a whole other world. Like little kids saying, oh, I don't give you consent, like little preschool kids to play with my toy. I've heard many, many stories like that. And to me, it's a reflection of the times that we're in now. Do you notice a change in the work that you've done over the generations? Like, do you still see that?
I do. I see a change. Look, I'm a parent of 3 kids myself, and I can't tell you the number of times that I've gotten calls from their teachers where, like, my 3-year-old, or when my child was 3, would say to the teacher something like, you just used the word secret, and only bad people ask kids to keep secrets, and my mom puts people like you in jail, so you're going to jail, right? Like, literally, like, if I tell you, and it wasn't even like you're not supposed to. It was like, you're not allowed to do that, and that's what bad people do, and my mom puts people like you in jail, and create such a ruckus that all the 3-year-olds are like, what do we do and where do we go? But I have seen a bit of a shift, and I think that there's more of both an interest and also an understanding that parents have to be able to navigate these issues with their kids. I see parents, message me all the time, or even just with the advent of social media and what's accessible to parents in terms of different resources, where they think about or talk about what it means to teach your kid about consent, right? Like, even I turn to my kids and will always say something like, hey, can I give you a hug? Right? Are you okay with me giving you a kiss right now? It's not because I don't want to grab them and hug them, because of course I do. It's because I want them to have ownership over the fact that nobody gets to touch you unless you're really comfortable with something like that happening. Even me, who gave birth to you, right? I don't have ownership over your body.
So I'm a big believer in the idea of tshuva, right? And that tshuva, repentance, requires, transparency and saying, this is what we've done wrong, and accepting that that's what it is, and that these are the systems that we're putting in place, or I'm personally putting in place, to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Because I believe that without these safeguards, without showing and demonstrating that you're planning on never doing this again, and you're putting up these things which will make sure that you don't do this again, tshuva doesn't really happen. And in the Jewish context, right, that to me is an essential feature of where Jewish organizations can and should be going for this. What has worked with regards to tshuva, so to speak, the moving forward for organizations that have dealt with these issues? And what are some of the concrete steps that you think should be taken or can be taken at the institutional level, at the micro level, in order that tshuva starts to happen within organizations?
So I actually have to disagree with you. And I have to disagree with you in order to answer your question. Please. Because though I believe that tshuva is, a huge piece, obviously, of being Jewish and of our ethos and philosophy and theology and practice, when it comes to things like abuse and harassment, tshuva may not have as big of a role or as big of a place, and maybe shouldn't be the first question or even the third question that we're asking about, right? If we put all of this bad behavior into one bucket, then it's really hard to have this conversation. But if we parse it out and talk about the differences between a teen interacting with a teen and not realizing that boundaries need to exist, then there's definitely room for us to be able to teach that and to be able to have people come back from that. But when we talk about pedophiles, when we talk about people that sexually abuse other people, when we talk about rapists or issues of sexual assault, tshuva is not a communal issue. It is absolutely the right of somebody that experienced it.
Well,
right?
I would push back. I would say that tshuva you need to have a path for tshuva for a pedophile, but part of that path of tshuva or that transparency is to say, I'm going away from here and I'm not going to go around to children ever again. Right. And I want you to know that in that, like, it's not about saying I'm sorry back to the person. Part of that tshuva is I'm never going to contact you or other children again. I'm just looking at what are the best practices within organizations that show that they're genuinely interested in changing and fixing and repairing what has gone wrong within the organizations.
Well, then I think you have to divide, right? I think you have to say there's a difference between looking at an individual or a person, someone who's a pedophile, someone who's sexually abused someone, and I think you have to remove the question of tshuva and even the concept of repentance from the equation when it comes to those acts and those people. And there is a difference between, let's say, an institution that's dealing with the fact that they've had historical abuse or that they have, swept something under the rug, or they're realizing that 30 years ago something really bad happened and now they're trying to make it right and they're trying to be able to be better. That type of institutional tshuva usually requires some kind of reckoning, an acknowledgement, right? A public reckoning or a public apology in some way. Or, many institutions will go back and either conduct some sort of fact-finding or investigation, will involve law enforcement, and a lot of it depends on the type of thing that has happened, right? When it comes to individuals, and I hear this a lot, like, how do we allow space for individuals that have done these bad things? Not institutions, but individuals. How do we allow space for their repentance? And I actually would never feel comfortable having that conversation, because when you have someone that, let's say, has sexually abused a child or has sexually assaulted someone in general, that's not actually a conversation I think we should be having, because their ability to come back into the fold or come back into the community actually isn't for us to opine on, because we weren't the person that was raped, right? And we weren't the person that was abused. And to be quite honest, when it comes to kids, I don't think that there's room for that. And you may disagree, which is totally fine.
I actually agree completely. I think that what I was looking at specifically was institutional tshuva, meaning, like, if you look at an organization that has had a point system amongst their teens for decades, and that basically turned a blind eye to it and saying, well, we sort of know that this exists, but we kind of deny it, or we push back on it, and we say this shouldn't exist and this is bad, and we don't condone this. But this article comes out and shows that this has been happening for decades and nobody did anything about it. Institutionally, an organization needs to reckon and admit, yes, this has happened. We didn't do anything about it for whatever reason, and they can and should be transparent. Maybe it's because, well, they were having Jewish babies and they were growing up and marrying other Jews, and we thought that was awesome, and that was part of the cost of it. And that's that reckoning. But what then happens? What do we go and say? How do you fix a problem like point systems amongst, like, sexually active teens?
You stop it from happening, and you have to be creative in how you do that. Right? You can't, if something hasn't worked in the past, if you're in a situation where something hasn't shifted or hasn't changed, even if the leadership has wanted it to change, or, like, intellectually everybody wants it to change, the bottom line is you have to be able to look at it and say, why is this happening? Is it happening because we're pushing this idea that everybody has to have, Jewish babies, right? Which is just, such an incredibly, like, inappropriate and uncomfortable, message to be sending teenagers. Is it because on some level there are those of us that actually think that there's something that's not so bad about it? Well, then that's really damaging, and we have to be able to deal with that. Is it about the leadership not seeing how serious it is? Is it about the way that we structure what it is that we do? A reckoning is more than just an apology. And it's more than an acknowledgement. It's about doing the hard work that's required in order to make change. And by the way, doing it as efficiently and really as right as you can. And so sometimes that might mean not just looking at your policies or your training, but actually actively saying, what is our plan for this particular Shabbaton or this retreat? What is our plan? How are we taking our staff and making sure that they have training? What are we saying to the kids that are involved here? And then what are we implementing over the course of the weekend? How are we not letting this slide? it takes a lot.
Those are all such important questions, and I really hope that there is a change. I'm way too old now to be going to any of these types of youth groups, but I really do hope that by the time that I have children and they're in these institutions, that there is a change and people are asking the hard questions.
Agreed.
I hope that these organizations know that you are a resource that can and should be used. I hope these organizations are hearing this and saying, wow, let's fix this. Let's do some institutional tshuva. And conversely, I also hope that very soon you'll be out of a job.
I know. I hope that also.
You're in one of those positions where we hope that your position never has to exist beyond you, and keep fighting the good fight and keep working with these organizations. Thank you so much, Rahel, for being here and talking to us about this.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really been wonderful.
As a follow-up, I was kind of curious about how this idea of consent is actually taught in sex ed classes. So I reached out to Stephanie Middleman, who is a faculty member at Concordia University, as well as an ASEC certified sex educator in Montreal. And here is that brief conversation.
We'd love to say that we could make consent sexy. I mean, if everybody got on board with that, half the battle there would be won. But, we don't have a lot of messages in our global society about making consent sexy. And a lot of adults are not necessarily sure to do or how to do that. And so it doesn't often get translated to our youth. But to your point, there certainly are entire chapters on consent in the Quebec mandatory sex education program. And that starts from kindergarten all the way up to secondary 5. And now consent isn't a subject that is addressed at every single grade level. Usually it's probably every second grade level, but there are a number of different activities and things that are discussed depending on the level of function and age of the child. So the younger ones will start with things like consent for, touching, who can see my body, who's not allowed to see my body, issues around friendships. And then as we scaffold and get older, then it becomes more about consent in terms of relationships and friendships and dating, and, who's allowed to do what and when. And also there really is a big push around getting people to use words to get verbal consent from someone else rather than just relying traditionally on facial expressions or body language. Like if you move into someone and they move back, that's generally not such a great sign. But we're trying to get people to learn to use the value of words. Like, I'm really into you. Would it be okay if I, kissed you? Would it be okay if I held your hand? And so I think that there's a process underway here, but it's going to take some time for everybody to be on board there. And of course, there are people that say, well, that's silly. It's not the kind of thing you talk about. But I actually believe that it's something that's very romantic and even in your word sexy, because if somebody says, hey, I'm really into you, can I, whatever, that might be something really nice for someone to hear. And then we also know that we're getting a very clear yes or no, and not just trying to assess of somebody's body language, facial expressions, because those are not always entirely accurate measures for how somebody is feeling, especially as something, as important around consent.
Let's move on to our nachas of the week, where we like to highlight something which has come across our radar and given us some nachas as Jewish Canadians. Melissa, what's been your nachas?
I am. I've got to say this, and I've lived in this country my entire life. I've been involved in advocacy efforts, since I understood what Zionism was to me, and I have never seen a community actually come together and work together. I've always seen different organizations say different things, and for the first time in my lifetime, and hopefully not the last, I see organizations who have different mandates who are all speaking about the same thing, and that's the rise in anti-Semitism and what we're actually going to do about it. And it happens, it happens with the conflict between Israel and the terrorist organization that seeks to destroy it, all the way to, Ben and Jerry's making political statements and a boycott movement. And I've never seen a community agree on so many things. So I hope that that continues. It's my nachas of the week. I hope it's the nachas of the year in my lifetime.
And I hope you get invited to the next anti-Semitism summit. Although, as we said, I hope there is no anti-Semitism summit, but if there is one, you should be on there.
I'm in the wrong party for that.
Alana, what's your nachas?
I got kind of excited about this new DC comic that's coming out. And I'm not a big superhero person, but I kind of want to read this one. It's the first Jewish superhero in over 40 years. Her name is Willow Zimmerman, and her superhero name is Whistle. Her sidekick is a Great Dane named Leibowitz. And the synopsis is Willow's often on the streets, protesting City Hall's neglect of her rundown Gotham neighborhood downriver, a former all-Jewish district based on New York's Lower East Side. How cool is that? So that's coming out on September 7th.
Wow, I had no idea. That's actually really, really cool.
It could be based on Avi Feingold. Like, you would make a good Jewish superhero.
Really? What's my superpower?
Making cocktails?
Is that a superpower?
Cocktail, like, what are they called? Molotov cocktails? I don't know.
That just escalated quickly.
There was a synagogue when I was living in Chicago that actually had a Molotov cocktail thrown in its window, and the newspaper accidentally, or I don't know what happened, there was some crossed wires there, and they called it a Mazel Tov cocktail.
Oh,
and I thought that was like hysterical. Everybody like made fun of it, and I was like, I should make a cocktail one day that is like a flaming mo, but we'll call it the Mazel Tov cocktail. But
what's yours, Avi? What do you got going?
I don't know if you noticed, but we didn't mention our rabbi word of the week yet. That's because I'm combining my idea of my nachas with a rabbinic voice. This really amazing guy, Dvir Kahana, who is a former Moshe House Montreal member who's now a rabbinical student in New York, has been rapping the Torah. And every week he has, for the Torah portion, a different rap. And he has this arts organization that is starting up soon. It is called the Amen Institute. You can go check it out at theameninstitute.com. They're just in the process of like rolling out things. But he was reaching out to me about this like Amen Institute. I was like, oh, that sounds cool. And he's telling me, I was like, oh, wait, you rap stuff? He goes, yeah, I have a Parsha rap for every week. I was like, cool. So without further ado, I present you my bar mitzvah portion, Va'et Hanan, right? This week's Torah portion, rapped by Dvir Kahana for my nachas of the week.
Just repeating everything my father gave to us kids. So productive, but don't lose the subjective. It's productive, not destructive. If only you knew how much your love gives. You know, the Lord, you go.
Thank you for listening to Bonjour Chai for Thursday, July 22nd. Our producer is Michael Freeman, technical production by Andre Goulet. Our music is by Secord. We are a project of the Jewish Living Lab and are distributed by the CJN Podcast Network. Subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave a comment and a rating on the platform of your choice and let us know what you think about our discussions on the CJN Lounge on Facebook. I'm Avi Feingold.
I'm Melissa Lantzman.
And I'm Ilana Zakon.
Solace and comfort, Alice and motherland.